This afternoon, we're starting off our first session talking about stories. I don't know how many of you choose a word of the year or choose a phrase every year. Some people think that's kind of frou-frou. And I did too for a very long time. But about 6 years ago, I really started seeking the Lord about some sort of a theme for our year. And ever since then, about November time, sometime around where we are now, I start thinking and asking the Lord to show me what the theme is for the next year. And this last year, I thought it was going to be one thing, and then it came to be another, and then it ended up something totally different, as God sometimes does, right? And my word for this year ended up being ampersand, the little and mark, right? And story put together. So, and story. And the story part is that he is continuing to write my story. He is continuing to shape the story of my life. And he also had some stories in my life that I needed to rewrite, that I needed healing from, that I needed to see in a different perspective, right? There were some stories that needed to in my own head and in my heart in order for him to do what he wanted to do with me in this last year. And the ampersand part of that was that when you see the ampersand in its original context, it was used sort of as an etc. word, meaning and also or and other things. But when you also see it in history, for instance, when it's used in music, when you see this piece of music was written by so-and-so and so-and-so, that if it's spelled out, that means that those two people collaborated in the same generation, like they actually worked together in the same lifetime on that piece of music. But if you see the ampersand, that means that those two people collaborated on that piece of music in different lifetime. So we may see that it was this piece is by so-and-so ampersand somebody else. That means they collaborated. But anyway, it means collaboration as well as and whatever else. And so the Lord really has impressed upon me that this year is all about stories. It's about growing your story, changing your story, letting God continue to write your story, and collaborating with others, and whatever else he brings. And so it's just amazing when you stop and look at story, what God can do. And today, God wants you to spend some time working on your story, or perhaps learning from your story. There are 3 types of story, and I'm just going to tell you what they are. The first type is epiphany. The second type is credibility. And the third type is breakthrough. Your big why going forward may have a lot to do with your story to this point. Every experience you have ever had has shaped you, and it shaped your vision, and it shaped the way that you serve others. It shaped the way you see the world. It shaped the way you show up in the world. And I am a firm believer that God wastes nothing in our lives. We may not ever understand it. It may be 10 years before we understand why we went through certain things. We may not ever know, but he doesn't ever waste anything. In fact, he is the redeemer of all things. And many times those things that we think are hard parts of our story or dark parts of our story, the Lord ends up being able to redeem for us in one way or another in the future. And all of this contributes to who you are and to how you serve your people and to how uniquely created you are for this specific job that he has given you. Starting off with Epiphany story, let's talk about that one first. An Epiphany story is something where you have like an aha moment. An Epiphany story is one of those sort of aha moments that really makes a pivot mark in your life or in your purpose. And for us, I remember when we first started our business, so we're thinking back to, we came to Mexico in 2007 as missionaries. 2010, we had a ministry change. 2011, we had another ministry change that basically left us kind of kicked out on our heels and had lost a lot of financial support, a lot of moral support through all of that as well. We found ourselves here in this little city by the sea in the south of Mexico, with no ministry to speak of, not very much money, no credit cards, no savings, 4 small children, and we're like, Lord, all right, we know it was you that brought us here, now what? Like, what are we here for, right? And the Lord showed us through a series of events that he was preparing for us to start a business to provide so that we could continue to stay in Mexico and do the work that he had laid on our hearts to do with the Spanish homeschool movement and now with the businesses and things. But at first, we didn't really know. And so we started this business that was going to provide homeschool material to Spanish-speaking families. There was only 2 or 3 other companies at that time that offered Spanish curriculum and you had to speak English to make the order, to order your curriculum from them. And we're like, well, that's kind of a problem. If you don't speak English, how are you going to order your materials, right? And so we created this business that would provide the customer service they needed and the curriculum that didn't exist prior to that. And we started working on this business. And I remember specifically the epiphany moment in those first years when I can remember where I was standing. The kitchen door was off to this side, and I walked from the kitchen into the living room, and here was their big dining room here, all, the laptop and the laundry and the leftovers from lunch and the kids playing all over. I remember stopping and looking at the scene and turning and looking at my husband and saying, you know what? When we start to see money from this, I want to be able to teach other women how to do this too, other people how to do this too. Because I knew the freedom that it was bringing our family. We weren't dependent anymore on if so-and-so approved of us to continue to send support so we had enough to pay our light bill that month, right? We weren't dependent anymore on whether the social media showed a good side that made everyone happy to continue to send money so that we could keep doing what we were doing. When we had a business that could provide for us, then we also had the complete freedom to do whatever God was asking us to do without worrying about man's influence to sustain this business, right? And I'm not dissing ministry in any way. I'm not dissing that mission's way of doing things. But for us, the Lord really showed us how that the freedom came when we were able to make decisions based on God as our provider, not man, based on what God was doing in our business, not who was sending money. And so that epiphany was, when we start making money with this, I want to teach other people how to do that too. And that changed the entire trajectory of the future of our business. Because once the homeschool business started making money, once we sold a couple of our books in English and the English homeschool blog started making money, then I was able to open up a coaching program and start teaching other people how to do what I was doing. I had to learn it all from scratch. I'd never been trained to run a business. I'd been trained to teach. I'd never been trained to do a website. I didn't know anything about payroll, taxes at the beginning. Like, you had to learn it all. But the Lord gave grace at every step. And at every step, we were able to use what we learned to go back and teach it to somebody else who needed to know it. And that was an epiphany for us, where the Lord just sort of gave us a vision of what was coming in the future. And it changed everything about the future of our business from there. And so I want you to be thinking, as we're going through some of these things, what is an epiphany in your own life? What is something that was an aha, or something that is so clear for you that when it happened, you knew it would change everything? Or maybe even afterwards, you look back and realize it was an epiphany. You know, that thought that I had back then, or when so-and-so said that, I had another epiphany that some people might call a prophetic experience, where a friend of mine told me, she says, I don't know what God's got going on with you, but I can guarantee you, in 2 to 3 years' time, you and your husband are going to be speaking on big stages to lots and lots of people. And look where we are now. 2 years later, we've had a conference for Spanish-speaking homeschoolers, a summit that hosted over 5,000 families. We just did a live training for 100 families a couple weeks ago in Spanish. We're hosting you all here, more than 100 people online today. And so those are epiphany times. What has God done in your life that shows that he's given you a glimpse of what's to come? And maybe it's this weekend. And if you don't have one, you're totally fine. I'm not saying you're unnormal, but these things shape us, and they give us confidence in what God is doing in our lives. And I want you to be open to recognizing his work as we go through this, because it's super important in how he's forming the vision for what he's giving you to do through your story.